silence was her only shield. In the 4 standard months since the Valcor hegemony had turned her world to glass and ash, the Cathar child named Zilia had not uttered a sound. Her new home, the sprawling orbital metropolis of Sanctuary Station, was a cacophony of 1,000 species, a constant assault of noise and motion that kept her trapped in the terror of her last memories. Doctors, diplomats, and droids had all tried to reach her. Their gentle words and placating gestures met with the same vacant, terrified stare from her enormous liquid black eyes. They saw a broken refugee, the last of her kind. But Jake Riley, a simple xenobotanist with dirt under his nails and a stubborn sense of hope, saw a child drowning in the quiet of her own mind. And he had a very, very unconventional idea. The observation deck of Sanctuary Station was designed for wonder. A 50-meter-high transparent aluminum pane offered a breathtaking vista of the Serpent's Coil Nebula, a swirling vortex of nascent stars and incandescent gas clouds. To most of the station's myriad inhabitants, it was a place of peace, a reminder of the galaxy's boundless beauty. To Zilia, it was just a bigger cage, the swirling colors, a mockery of the vibrant skies she could no longer remember without a spike of searing pain. She sat on a polished plasteel bench, a small, fragile figure huddled in an oversized Terran Alliance refugee blanket. Her species, the Cathar, were known for their empathic connection to nature, and their subtly chameleonic skin, which shifted in hue and pattern to reflect their emotional state. In the lore, Vid's Cathar were depicted with skin like polished mahogany, swirled with gold when content, or the deep emerald of a forest canopy when contemplative. Xylia's skin was the flat, chalky grey of slate, a colour that screamed of profound shock and unending grief. Her large obsidian eyes, which should have been filled with the curiosity of a child, she was barely 7 Terran years old, were fixed on the nebula, but saw nothing. They saw only fire and heard only screams. Jacob Riley watched her from a respectful distance, leaning against a hydroponics planter filled with genetically engineered Jovian ferns. For weeks he had made this his ritual. He'd finish his shift managing the station's arboretum, a lush green haven of synthetic trees and alien flora, and come here hoping for a sign, a flicker, anything. He wasn't a psychologist or a child specialist. He was a man who understood growth, patience, and the silent language of living things that couldn't speak. He saw in Zilia a sapling scorched by a fire, its roots still clinging to life, but its leaves refusing to unfurl. The official channels had all but given up. Dr. Aris Thorne, the station's impeccably dressed and politically savvy administrator, had declared her case a tragic but stable psychological impasse. She was fed, clothed, and physically healthy. She was a symbol of Valcor brutality and Terran compassion, a perfect little martyr for diplomatic communiques. To Jake, this clinical detachment was a quiet form of cruelty. They were keeping her body alive while her spirit withered. He'd tried everything the experts suggested. He brought her a data slate with holographic images of Catharia Prime, reconstructed from survey logs. She'd flinched so violently, her skin had bleached to a terrifying bone white, and she'd hidden under her cot for 2 days. He'd tried bringing her a Cathar Laura fruit, a sweet, bell-shaped delicacy he'd managed to cultivate in the arboretum. The scent meant to evoke comfort had triggered a silent, shuddering panic attack. He had learned that every piece of her past was now a landmine. Today he tried a different approach. He didn't bring anything. He just sat on a bench 20 feet away, pulled out a small, worn harmonica, and began to play. It wasn't a lullaby or a mournful dirge. It was a simple, rambling folk tune he'd learned from his grandfather, back on a terraformed moon orbiting Saturn. It was a tune about planting seeds and waiting for the rain, full of gentle meandering notes. For a long moment there was no reaction. Zilia remained a statue carved from grief. But then Jake saw it. A barely perceptible tilt of her head. One of her delicate three-fingered hands, which had been clenched into a tight fist, uncurled slightly. Her gaze didn't shift from the nebula, but the rigid set of her shoulders seemed to soften by a fraction of a degree. It was the most progress he'd seen in a month. He finished the tune and put the harmonica away, careful not to make any sudden movements. He didn't speak. He just gave her a small, sad smile that she didn't see and left. As he walked back towards his residential block, a desperate, wild idea began to take root in his mind. The specialists had tried to connect with her mind, to reason with her trauma. They had tried to connect her to her past, a past that was nothing but pain. What if the answer wasn't something complex and alien? What if it was something simple, primal, and overwhelmingly alive? What if she didn't need a memory, but a new, uncomplicated connection? The idea was insane. It was against at least a dozen station regulations, from animal quarantine protocols to species interaction mandates. Administrator Thorne would have him spaced if he found out. But as he looked back at the tiny grey figure silhouetted against a backdrop of dying stars, Jake knew he had to try. The risk of doing nothing was far, far greater. She wasn't stable. She was fading away, and he refused to stand by and watch another star go out. Sanctuary Station, for all its diplomatic posturing, had a thriving black market that operated in the maintenance corridors and decommissioned cargo bays of its lower decks. It was a place where you could get anything from Rigelian spice ale to decommissioned plasma coils, no questions asked. A live, non-sapient terrestrial animal, however, was a different order of magnitude. It was contraband of the highest, smelliest, and most problematic order. Jake's first stop was a grizzled ex-freighter captain named Silas Sully Vance, who now ran a dimly lit bar called The Void's End. The place smelled of stale beer and ozone. Sully was a mountain of a man with a cybernetic arm that whirred softly whenever he polished a glass. A dog. Sully's laughter was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. "Riley, you've been sniffing too much of that exotic pollen in your garden. You know what Thorne does to people who break quarantine. He doesn't find them. He makes them an example." "I know the risk, Sully," Jake said, his voice low and earnest. He slid a handful of credit chips across the sticky bar. "This isn't for a lark. It's for the Cathar girl." Sully's good eye narrowed. He, like everyone on the station, knew of the silent refugee. He pushed the credits back towards Jake. "The kid, huh?" He sighed a surprisingly weary sound from such a large man. He wiped down the bar with a rag that had seen better decades. "There's a freighter, the Stardust Drifter, making a supply run from the Armstrong colony on Kepler 186F. They're known to transport livestock for colony startups. They're also known to be flexible for the right price." He looked at Jake hard. "Their docking window is in 3 days. They'll be in Bay 7 lower cargo ring. Talk to a guy named Wren. Tell him Sully said to treat you right." But Jake, he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you get caught, I don't know you. And this conversation never happened. Thorne would shut me down and use my cybernetics for spare parts." "Understood," Jake said, gratitude welling up inside him. "Thank you, Sully." The next 3 days were a blur of nervous activity. Jake converted a large storage locker in his modest quarters into a makeshift den, soundproofing the walls with insulating foam and installing a discreet atmospheric scrubber to handle the inevitable biological byproducts. He used his botany credentials to requisition nutrient paste and protein supplements re-engineering the formula into something a canine digestive system could handle. On the third day, he made his way down to Cargo Bay 7. The place was a chaotic symphony of clanging metal, hissing hydraulics, and shouted commands in a dozen languages. He found Wren a wiry man with nervous eyes, overseeing the unloading of hydroponic equipment. After exchanging the code phrase and a much heavier stack of credit chips, Wren led him to a quiet corner of the cavernous bay. There, in a small, shielded transport crate, was the most illegal creature on Sanctuary Station. It was a golden retriever puppy about 10 weeks old. The moment Wren opened the crate, the puppy blinked in the harsh bay lighting, let out a small yip, and then proceeded to stumble over its own oversized paws, its tail a blur of excited motion. It looked up at Jake with wide, trusting brown eyes, and in that instant, Jake knew he'd made the right decision. Smuggling the puppy whom Jake had already decided to call Buster back to his quarters was the most stressful hour of his life. He'd hidden the pup in a modified soil transport container, heart pounding with every security patrol that passed. But they made it. Back in the apartment, Buster explored his new world with boundless curiosity, sniffing every corner, tasting a loose thread on Jake's rug, and finally collapsing in a fluffy golden heap on the makeshift bed Jake had prepared. The next morning, Jake felt a thrill of fear and hope that left his hands trembling. He placed Buster in a soft-sided carrier bag, slung it over his shoulder, and headed for the observation deck. Zilia was there in her usual spot, a small grey ghost against the cosmos. Jake approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. He sat down on the floor about 15 feet away from her and placed the carrier on the ground. He didn't say a word. He just unzipped the top. Buster's head popped out, ears flopping. He looked around his nose, twitching. His eyes landed on the small, still figure on the bench. He let out another soft yip of inquiry. For the first time in 4 months, Zilia moved with purpose. It was a flinch, a sharp, fearful recoil, and her skin paled further. She pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself an even smaller target. It was the reaction Jake had dreaded. He felt a stone sink in his stomach. I've made it worse. But Buster, with the simple, unburdened wisdom of a puppy, didn't see a threat. He saw something new. He clumsily clambered out of the carrier, his paws skittering on the polished floor. He took a few hesitant steps toward her, then stopped, sitting back on his haunches. He tilted his head, his tail giving a single hopeful thump against the floor. He wasn't approaching like the doctors or the diplomats with their agendas and expectations. He was just there, open, curious. Zilia watched him, her huge black eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else. Something Jake hadn't seen before, a flicker of intrigue. The puppy whined softly, a gentle questioning sound. It was so different from the harsh metallic sounds of the station, or the terrifying explosions of her memory. It was a living sound, a warm sound. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Zilia lowered her feet back to the floor. Her hand, still trembling, uncurled from the blanket. Buster, taking this as an invitation, scooted a few inches closer on his belly, his tail now wagging a tentative rhythm against the deck. He lowered his head, a classic instinctual gesture of submission and peace. Jake held his breath. The entire universe seemed to shrink to the space between the alien child and the terrestrial puppy. After what felt like an eternity, Zilia extended a single, hesitant finger. She reached out her hand, shaking, and gently touched the top of Buster's soft, furry head. The moment her skin made contact with his fur, something shifted. A faint, almost invisible wave of color washed over her hand, a pale, rosy blush that faded as quickly as it appeared. Buster responded by licking her finger with his warm, wet tongue. Zilia didn't smile, But she didn't pull away, and for the first time since her world had ended, her eyes were not looking through the present into the horrors of the past. They were focused. They were present. They were seeing the small, furry, unconditionally friendly creature in front of her. A single silent tear traced a path down her grey cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was the first drop of a long frozen thaw. The days that followed settled into a new, fragile routine. Every morning, Jake would bring Buster to the observation deck, and every morning, Zelia would be there, waiting. The initial terror had been replaced by a cautious curiosity that slowly, painstakingly blossomed into trust. Buster was the perfect ambassador. He didn't care that Zelia was an alien or that she was silent. He didn't want anything from her except a gentle hand and a playmate. He was a creature of pure, uncomplicated affection. Their progress was measured not in words, but in inches and colors. The first day she had only touched his head. The next she stroked his back, her fingers tracing the patterns in his golden fur. By the end of the week, she was letting him rest his head in her lap. With each gentle interaction, a little more color seeped back into her skin. The flat, lifeless grey began to give way to faint, swirling undertones of lavender and pale blue like watercolors bleeding onto damp paper. Jake watched from a distance, playing the role of silent guardian. He never pushed, never interrupted. He simply provided the space for this strange, beautiful friendship to grow. He brought Buster's food and water, cleaned up his messes, and spent his nights worrying about Administrator Thorne discovering his secret. The risk was enormous, but the reward was watching a child slowly return to the world of the living. One afternoon, about 3 weeks into their routine, Jake brought a small, soft rubber ball. He rolled it gently towards Buster, who pounced on it with clumsy delight, batting it around with his paws. He eventually picked it up, trotted over to Zelia, and dropped the slobber-covered ball at her feet, looking up at her with expectant eyes. Zelia stared at the ball, then at Buster. Her expression was unreadable. For a long moment, she did nothing. Jake's heart sank a little, thinking perhaps this was too much too soon. But then she bent down, picked up the ball with a delicate, deliberate motion, and weakly tossed it a few feet away. Buster yelped with joy and scrambled after it. He brought it back, dropping it again. She threw it again, this time a little farther. A game. It was a simple, universal game of fetch played in silence between a girl from a dead world and a puppy from Earth under the watchful gaze of a nebula thousands of light years away. As she threw the ball for the 5th time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. It was fleeting, as fragile as a soap bubble, but it was there. And with it, a swirl of warm, sunny yellow bloomed on her cheeks. Jake felt his own eyes sting. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Their sanctuary, however, could not remain isolated forever. Administrator Oris Thorne was a man who prided himself on knowing everything that happened on his station. He was a creature of data reports and surveillance. A significant unlogged change in the station's most famous refugee was bound to attract his attention. He found Jake in the arboretum tending to a crop of bioluminescent fungi. Thorne was as always immaculate in his dark grey Alliance uniform, not a single hair out of place. He moved with a practiced politician's grace that set Jake's teeth on edge. Mr. Riley Thorne began, his voice smooth as polished stone. "I've been reviewing the psych reports on our young Cathar ward, Zelia. For months, they've been static. Depressingly so. Yet in the last few weeks, the medical sensors in her quarters have noted a decrease in her cortisol levels. Her sleep patterns are less disturbed. The care droids report she is finishing her nutrient rations. Remarkable progress, wouldn't you agree, Jake's hands froze over the fungi. He kept his back to Thorn, trying to keep his expression neutral. "She's a resilient child, Administrator. Resilience requires a catalyst," Thorn countered, stepping closer. His eyes scanned the arboretum, but Jake felt they were boring into his back. "Dr. Evans, our chief psychologist, is baffled. She believes some environmental factor must have changed. I was hoping you, having taken such a personal interest in the child, might have some insight." This was it. The moment Jake had been dreading. He turned, wiping his hands on a cloth, forcing a calm he did not feel. "I've just been giving her space. Sometimes healing isn't about what you do, but what you don't do." Thorn smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "A refreshingly simplistic philosophy, Mr. Riley. And yet I can't help but feel there's more to it. I have reports of you making unusual requisitions. Protein supplements not consistent with known flora. Acoustic dampening foam. Odd shipping inquiries logged from your terminal." He paused, letting the words hang in the humid air. "Tell me, Mr. Riley. What aren't you telling me?" Jake's mind raced. Denial was useless. Thorn was too clever for that. He had to control the narrative. "I've been employing a form of biofeedback therapy, Administrator, using non-sapient sound and scent patterns to stimulate a positive neurological response." It was a weak, jargon-filled lie, and he knew it. Thorn's smile didn't waver. "Fascinating. I would very much like to observe one of these sessions." He looked at his data slate. "Shall we say the observation deck tomorrow at 0900? It wasn't a request. Jake's blood ran cold. He was trapped. He could refuse, and Thorn would simply authorize a search of his quarters. Or he could agree, and his secret would be out. He chose the latter, hoping against hope he could somehow manage the situation. Of course, Administrator Jake managed to say, his voice tight. It is. As Thorn turned and walked away, his polished boots clicking on the walkway, Jake felt a profound sense of dread. He hadn't just endangered himself. He had endangered Zilia and the fragile, beautiful world she was building with a small golden puppy. The whispers of their secret friendship were about to become a shout, and he feared Thorn was not a man who appreciated noise. The next morning, Jake felt like he was walking to his own execution. Buster trotted happily beside him, oblivious to the tension radiating from his human. When they reached the observation deck, Zilia was already there. As soon as she saw Buster, a soft sea-green color washed over her skin, and she knelt to greet him with a gentle rub behind the ears. The sight gave Jake a pang of fierce, protective love. Precisely at 0900, the door hissed open, and Administrator Thorn entered, flanked by two stern-faced station security guards. His eyes immediately fell on the puppy who had stopped playing and was now standing near Zilia, letting out a low, uncertain growl. Thorn's smooth facade finally cracked. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and a muscle twitched in his jaw. "A canine," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "A Canis lupus familiaris. Here, on my station." Administrator Jake began stepping forward, positioning himself slightly between Thorn and Zilia. "Her name is Zilia. The puppy's name is Buster. And he is the biofeedback therapy I told you about. Look at her. Just look." Thorn's gaze shifted to Zilia. She had shrunk back at the sight of the guards, the green of her skin paling to a fearful grey, but she kept one hand firmly on Buster's back, grounding herself. The puppy, sensing her fear, stood his ground, a furry little sentinel. "The regulations are clear," Mr. Riley Thorn said, his voice regaining its cold composure. "Section 7, subsection Gamma of the interspecies, quarantine mandate. Unauthorized introduction of non-native fauna is a Class A felony. The animal must be disposed of, and you will be confined pending a formal hearing." The word was a gasp, a whisper, but it cut through the air with the force of a thunderclap. It was reedy and unused, but it was undeniably a voice. Everyone froze. Thorn, the guards, even Jake. They all stared at Zilia. She was looking directly at Thorn, her large black eyes blazing with a defiance no one had ever seen in her before. Her skin was a maelstrom of swirling colors, fear gray, anger red, and a protective, vibrant violet. "No," she said again, her voice a little stronger this time. She wrapped her arms around Buster's neck, burying her face in his fur. Jake felt a surge of adrenaline. "Administrator, you heard her." She spoke. For the first time in months, she spoke. You can't take him away from her. He's the only thing that's reached her. Thorn looked from the defiant child to the determined botanist. For a moment, Jake thought he saw a flicker of something human in the administrator's eyes, a hint of conflict, but it was quickly extinguished, replaced by a cold, calculating mask. "The law is the law," Thorn said, flatly. "It exists to protect the thousands of residents on this station from biological contamination. I cannot make an exception for one child, no matter how tragic her circumstances." He nodded to the guards. "Secure the animal." But as the guards moved forward, Jake did something he never thought he was capable of. He moved to block them. "You'll have to go through me." The situation was escalating the tension in the room, thick enough to choke on. But before the guards could shove Jake aside, Thorn raised a hand. "Wait." He looked at Zilia, a strange, intense expression on his face. "You are Cathar. Your people. They had abilities, a connection to the living world, a resonance." He was no longer speaking to her like a child, but like a specimen. "What else can you do?" The question was so odd, so out of place, that it momentarily stunned everyone. Jake frowned. "Resonance. What is he talking about?" He didn't have to wait long for an answer. That night, unable to sleep, Jake found himself deep in the station's public archives, a place he usually only visited to look up botanical data. Spurred by Thorn's strange words, he bypassed the public-facing files on the Cathar, the sanitized accounts of their peaceful artistic culture, and used a low-level access code he'd been given for his arboretum work to delve into restricted military intelligence. What he found chilled him to the bone. The official story was that the Valcor hegemony, a brutal expansionist empire, had destroyed Catharia Prime for its strategic location. The truth was far more terrifying. The Cathar were not just empaths. They were what the military analysts called biopsionics. They possessed a latent genetic ability to resonate with and manipulate living ecosystems on a planetary scale. They could accelerate growth, purify toxins, and, in theory, terraform a dead rock into a paradise in a fraction of the time it would take Alliance technology. They were the galaxy's ultimate gardeners. The Valcor hadn't just committed genocide for a planet. They were hunting a genetic trait, and according to the file, they believed a handful of Cathar might have escaped the initial bombardment. They were hunting for survivors, not to kill them but to capture them, to vivisect them, to weaponize their gift. Suddenly, Thorn's unsettling interest made a horrifying kind of sense. His questions, his focus on her abilities, his sudden appearance. He wasn't just a bureaucrat enforcing a rule. He was looking for something. A new, more urgent fear seized Jake. He pulled up the station's external docking logs, cross-referencing them with known Valcor ship registries disguised under shell corporations. And there it was. A small, unmarked diplomatic courier, a ship model known to be favored by the Valcor Intelligence Service, had docked 2 days ago. Its passenger was listed under a low-level diplomatic credential, but the biometrics were flagged as classified. Thorne wasn't just planning to take Buster away. He wasn't just a stickler for the rules. He was vetting Zilia. He was confirming she was what the Valcour were looking for. The hearing, the quarantine threat, it was all a charade, a test. He had provoked her, gotten her to speak, to show an emotional, psionic flair. He was preparing to hand her over. The shadow of the Valcour wasn't just in Zilia's past. It was here. It was on Sanctuary Station. And Administrator Thorne had just unlocked the door and invited it inside. Jake's blood ran cold. This was no longer about saving a child's spirit. It was about saving her life. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow, leaving him breathless in the sterile glow of the archive terminal. Thorne wasn't just a collaborator. He was a broker, and Zilia was the transaction. The entire station, a place named Sanctuary, was about to become the site of the most profound betrayal imaginable. He raced back to his quarters, his mind a chaotic whirl of plans and contingencies. He had to get Zilia and Buster off the station, but how every shuttle, every freighter, every escape pod was monitored by Thorne's office. He was a botanist, not a spy. He had no weapons, no special training, just a desperate resolve. He burst into his apartment to find Zilia asleep on his sofa, curled up with Buster, nestled against her. The puppy's flank rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and Zilia's skin was a calm, peaceful, cerulean blue. In her sleep, she looked like what she was, a child, innocent and untroubled. The sight solidified Jake's determination into a diamond-hard point. He would burn the station to the ground before he let anyone take her. He began to pack, throwing nutrient packs, a medkit, and Buster's food into a durable duffel bag. As he worked, a thought struck him. Sully. The grizzled bartender had connections. He was a risk, but he was the only risk Jake had. He gently woke Zilia. "Hey," he whispered, his voice soft. "We have to go. We're going on an adventure." She looked at him, her large eyes blinking sleepily. She didn't question him. The trust she had placed in Buster, she had extended to him. She simply nodded, her gaze clear and steady, and picked up the now-awake puppy. Navigating the station's corridors was a nightmare. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every passing security droid made Jake's heart leap into his throat. They stuck to the less-traveled service conduits and maintenance tunnels, the grimy underbelly of the gleaming station. Buster seemed to sense the urgency, staying quiet in Zilia's arms, occasionally licking her chin as if to reassure her. They found Sully closing up the void's end. When he saw the panic in Jake's eyes, and the child and the dog with him, his gruff demeanor dropped. "Thorne." Jake said the name like a curse on his lips. "He's working with the Valcour. He's going to give her to them." Sully's face, a roadmap of past brawls and bad decisions, hardened. He cursed a string of creative multi-species oaths. "I never liked that slick son of a..." He cut himself off, glancing at Zilia. "The Stardust Drifter is still here. An engine malfunction. Or at least that's the official story. Ren owes me more than one favor." He moved quickly, his cybernetic arm whirring as he keyed a command into a hidden panel behind the bar. "This will open a pressure hatch into the lower cargo ring's waste disposal network. It's airtight, but it stinks. It'll bypass the main security checkpoints and get you close to Bay 7. He handed Jake a small, heavy plasma pistol. "I took this off a Zarkonian bounty hunter who couldn't pay his tab. I hope you don't need it, but I'd rather you have it and not need it than..." He trailed off. "Sully, I can't ask you to. You're not asking." Sully interrupted his voice, a low growl. "Thorne's a snake, and I don't abide by snakes in my garden. Now go. The hatch is at the end of the service hall. It'll stay open for 10 minutes. As they hurried down the dark corridor, the station's alert klaxons, suddenly blared to life, casting the hallway in strobing red lights. A cold, synthesized voice echoed from the overhead speakers. "Security alert. Unidentified quarantine breach. Level 3 lockdown initiated. All residents report to designated safe zones. This is not a drill." "He knows," Jake breathed, his blood turning to ice. "He knows we're gone." They reached the pressure hatch and scrambled through into the claustrophobic, foul-smelling tube of the disposal network. Just as the hatch sealed behind them, they heard the heavy thud of mag boots on the other side. Their escape through the network was a disorienting journey through darkness and grime. Finally, they emerged through another hatch into the chaotic din of the lower cargo ring. Bay 7 was just ahead. They could see the hulking, scarred fuselage of the Stardust drifter. Freedom was tantalizingly close. And then their path was blocked. Administrator Thorne stood before them, flanked not by station security this time, but by two towering figures in polished black armor. Their helmets were insectoid, their rifles long and menacing. Valcor. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Mr. Riley?" Thorne asked, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "I am saving this station. A peace treaty with the hegemony, a cessation of hostilities on all our outer colonies. All it costs is one biologically gifted child, a small price to pay for the lives of millions." "It's not your price to pay," Jake snarled, shoving Zilia behind him and raising the plasma pistol. His hands were shaking, but his aim was steady. One of the Valcor warriors laughed, a grating, clicking sound. "Put down the toy botanist." "Zilia," Jake whispered, not taking his eyes off their enemies. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Just run to that ship." But Zilia didn't run. She peeked out from behind Jake's legs, her eyes locked on the Valcor. The color of her skin was draining away, leaving her a stark, ghostly white. The terror was back, a tidal wave of memory and pain. Buster in her arms began to snarl, a deep, guttural sound of pure fury that was terrifying, coming from such a small animal. "The asset is experiencing trauma regression," the other Valcor noted in a cold, analytical tone. "It may damage her potential. We should sedate her." As the warrior raised its rifle, Buster did something incredible. He launched himself from Zilia's arms, a golden blur of motion. He was impossibly fast, a tiny missile of righteous indignation. He latched his sharp puppy teeth onto the armored ankle of the Valcor, who had threatened her. It was a futile gesture. The armor was too thick, but it was a distraction. The Valcor looked down in surprise, momentarily forgetting his target. And in that moment of distraction, Jake fired. The bolt of plasma struck the Valcor square in the chest, sending him staggering backward with a cry of shock. The other soldier immediately raised its weapon, but Thorne shouted, "No, don't kill him! We need the child unharmed." The momentary hesitation was all Jake needed. "Run, Zilia, now!" he screamed. Xylia jolted from her fear. By Buster's bravery, finally ran. She sprinted towards the Stardust drifter's boarding ramp, clutching a stunned Buster who had been shaken loose. Jake fired another shot, forcing Thorne and the remaining Valcor to duck behind some cargo containers. He turned to follow Zilia, but Thorne was faster than he looked. The administrator lunged not with a weapon, but with a hypersonic stunner. A high-frequency wave hit Jake, and his world dissolved into a cacophony of white noise and blinding light. He collapsed to the deck, his last conscious thought a desperate prayer that Zilia had made it to the ship. Darkness gave way to a splitting headache. Jake awoke to the cold metallic taste of the cargo bay floor and the sight of Administrator Thorne's polished boots. The remaining Valcor warrior stood over him, its rifle aimed at his head. A few yards away, Zilia was backed against the drifter's boarding ramp, tears streaming down her face. She was holding Buster so tightly the poor pup was whimpering. Thorne had her cornered. The heroic botanist, Thorn sneered, prodding Jake with the toe of his boot. Your foolishness is going to be the death of you, and it has only delayed the inevitable. He turned his attention back to Zelia. Come now, child. Cooperate, and your human friend might be allowed to live out his life in a labor colony. Zelia shook her head, a silent, frantic gesture of defiance. Her skin was a chaotic, flickering mess of grey and white, the colours of pure terror. She took a step back, up the ramp, and bumped into a figure standing in the ship's shadow. It was Wren, the wiry smuggler, his face pale with fear. I'm sorry, he stammered at Thorn. I didn't know. Silence, the Valkor commanded. Take the child. As Thorn reached for her, a deep, primal fear took hold of Zelia. It was the memory of another hand, clad in black armor, reaching for her mother. It was the memory of fire, of loss, of being utterly and completely alone. She saw Buster, her only friend, threatened. She saw Jake, her only protector, lying helpless on the ground. Something inside her, a dam that had held back a lifetime of grief and a lineage of power, finally broke. She opened her mouth, and this time it was not a word that came out. It was a sound. It was a silent scream. There was no audible noise, but a wave of pure psionic energy erupted from her, a focused blast of raw, untamed bio-psionic force. It wasn't an attack of destruction, but of connection. The Valkor warrior screamed inside its helmet as it was suddenly flooded with the sensory input of every single living thing in the Arboretum. The confusion of 1,000 plants, the thirst of their roots, the slow, patient process of photosynthesis. It was 1 billion years of evolution crammed into a single second. The warrior collapsed, clutching its helmet, its advanced nervous system completely overwhelmed. Thorn, being human, was less affected, but he still staggered back, clutching his head, as he felt a phantom echo of the station's entire microbiome. The bacteria in the air, vents, the algae in the water, recyclers. He looked at Zelia with a new expression, not of greed, but of awe and terror. What are you? Jake, shaking off the last of the stunner's effects, saw his chance. He scrambled to his feet and tackled Thorn with the full force of his body. The two men went down in a heap, the stunner skittering across the floor. Jake was a botanist, but he'd spent his life hauling heavy equipment and bags of soil. He was stronger than the lithe administrator. From the top of the ramp, Wren, seeing his chance to get on the right side of a very bad situation, slammed his fist on the emergency ramp control. With a loud hiss of hydraulics, the heavy metal ramp began to rise. "Zelia, get on board!" Jake yelled, struggling to pin Thorn. The Valkor warrior was starting to recover, shaking its head to clear the psionic static. It raised its rifle, aiming for Jake, but it had forgotten about Buster. With a ferocious bark, the puppy shot down the closing ramp. He wasn't going for an ankle this time. He leaped a flash of gold and sank his teeth into the Valkor's exposed wrist, right where the armored glove met the suit. The warrior bellowed in pain and surprise, its aim thrown off. The plasma bolt went wide, searing a black scorch mark on the bulkhead inches from Jake's head. The ramp was almost closed. "Buster, come!" Zelia cried, her voice clear and strong, her hand outstretched. Hearing her voice, Buster let go and scrambled back up the ramp, diving through the narrowing gap just as it sealed shut with a deafening clang. Inside the ship, Zelia scooped him up, her tears now flowing from relief. Wren, sweating and shaking, was already at the cockpit. "Strap in," he yelled. "Sully's been overriding their docking clamps remotely, but it won't last long." The Stardust Drifter's engines roared to life. Through the cockpit viewport, Jake saw Thorn pounding his fists on the exterior of the ship in impotent rage as security forces swarmed the bay. With a lurch that threw Jake back into his seat, the old freighter pulled away from its mooring, cleared the station's magnetic containment field, and jumped into the swirling, star-dusted chaos of hyperspace. They were free. Jake slumped into the co-pilot's chair, his body aching, his mind reeling. Zilia came forward, Buster trotting at her heels. She stood before Jake, her skin now a steady, gentle pattern of warm gold and verdant green, the colors of contentment and life. "You saved me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We saved each other." Jake replied, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and ruffled the fur on Buster's head. The puppy licked his hand enthusiastically. "All of us." Zilia looked at Buster, then back at Jake. For the first time, she gave him a true, radiant smile. It was like watching a sunrise. "Here's my color," she said, using a Cathar word. "What does that mean?" Jake asked softly. "It means heart friend," she explained, "the one who wakes the spirit." She then pointed from herself to Jake, and then to Buster. "We are a Kala." Jake smiled back, a real deep smile that reached his eyes. He was no longer just a botanist, and she was no longer just an orphan. He was her protector, her guardian, her family, a man and his ward, and of course a girl and her dog. Together they were a heart friendship, a pack, a family forged in crisis, heading towards an unknown future, leaving the shadows behind them. The Stardust Drifter was not a vessel of comfort. It was a cramped utilitarian ship that smelled faintly of engine coolant and whatever illicit cargo Wren had been hauling last week. But to Jake, Xylia, and Buster, it was the most beautiful ship in the galaxy. It was the sound of safety, the smell of freedom. Wren, once he got over the adrenaline of his first ever firefight, proved to be a decent man. Guided by a series of encrypted messages from Sully, he set a course for a small, uncharted Terran colony in the Phoenix Cluster, a haven for those seeking a fresh start, far from the politics of the core worlds. The journey took 2 weeks. In that time, the cockpit of the old freighter transformed into a home. Zilia, no longer trapped in silence, was a supernova of curiosity. Her voice, once a reedy whisper, grew stronger each day as she peppered Jake and Wren with questions about the ship, the stars, hyperspace, and Earth. She wanted to know everything about the world that had produced something as wonderful as Buster. She learned to play fetch in the narrow confines of the cargo hold, her laughter echoing off the metal walls. She helped Jake prepare their nutrient-paced meals, her delicate fingers surprisingly nimble. The colors of her skin were a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of emotion, no longer dominated by gray. She glowed with the soft yellow of happiness when she played with Buster, deepened to a thoughtful emerald when she watched the star charts over Wren's shoulder, and settled into a warm, mahogany brown of contentment when she fell asleep, curled up next to Jake, with Buster at their feet. Her psionic abilities, once unleashed by terror, were now a source of wonder. She couldn't move objects or read minds, but she had a profound connection to life. She could sense when the ship's small hydroponic vegetable patch needed water long before the sensors did. One day, she held her hand over a wilting earth rose Jake had kept in a small pot, and to his astonishment, the petals seemed to perk up, a blush of color returning to them. Her gift wasn't a weapon. It was a nurturing touch, the very essence of her people. Jake in turn found a new purpose. He was no longer just a caretaker of plants. He was the guardian of the last Cathar. He taught her to read English from his data slate, starting with simple children's stories. He told her about his grandfather's farm, about rain and snow, and the changing of seasons on Earth. He was building a new past for her, one filled not with fire and screams, but with gentle stories and the promise of a future. Their final day in transit, they stood before the cockpit viewport, watching as a blue-green marble of a planet grew larger. New Terra, the colony. It was a world of vast oceans, green continents, and a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. "Is it like your home?" Zilia asked softly, her hand resting on the cool viewport. "No," Jake said honestly. "But it can be our home. We can plant a garden." She looked up at him, her huge black eyes reflecting the image of their new world, with a place for Buster to run, with a place big enough for 100 Busters to run, Jake promised, smiling. Buster, as if sensing he was the topic of conversation, nudged his head under Zilia's hand and let out a happy sigh. Zilia leaned against Jake, a small, warm weight of trust and affection. The three of them stood there in comfortable silence, a former botanist, the last daughter of a dead star, and a very good boy, a strange and wonderful family, watching their new dawn rise. The terror was gone, the silence was broken, and her heart, once an orphaned and shattered thing, was whole again, healed by the simplest and most powerful force in the universe, the unconditional love of a puppy. The ramp of the Stardust Drifter lowered with a final weary hiss, opening not onto the sterile decking of a space station, but onto a world teeming with life. The air that washed over them was thick and sweet, a complex perfume of damp soil, blooming flora, and distant rain. It was utterly alien, and yet felt more like home than any recycled atmosphere ever could. Buster, unable to contain himself, shot down the ramp like a golden cannonball, barking with pure, unadulterated joy as his paws touched soft green grass for the first time in his life. He rolled and tumbled in it, a whirlwind of ecstatic energy. Zilia stood at the top of the ramp, hesitating. Her hand found Jake's, her grip tight. For months, the only ground beneath her feet had been unyielding plasteel. The living, breathing world before her was overwhelming. "It's okay," Jake said softly, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "This is the good part." He led her down the ramp. As her small boots sank slightly into the soft turf, she gasped. A tremor ran through her, and Jake watched, fascinated, as the skin on her hands and face bloomed with a pattern of vibrant, intricate green, mirroring the moss on a nearby rock. She knelt, pressing her palm flat against the ground, her eyes closed, and a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. "It's quiet," she whispered, though the air was filled with the chirping of unseen creatures and the rustle of the wind. Jake understood. She didn't mean audible noise. She meant the planet's life force, its biosignature. It was calm, balanced, and welcoming. There was no pain in this soil. They were met by a woman with weathered features and kind eyes, named Evelyn Miller, the governor of the small settlement, aptly named Promise. Sully's encrypted message had told her just enough. Refugees, political asylum, give them land and leave them be. Promise wasn't a city. It was a handful of sturdy, prefabricated habitats nestled in a river valley, a frontier town at the edge of the galaxy. Governor Miller assigned them a small but comfortable dwelling on a hill overlooking the river, providing them with startup rations, atmospheric converters, and a set of agricultural tools. "The land is fertile," she said with a simple nod. "Work it and it'll provide. Welcome to New Terra. We hope you find peace here." Those first few weeks were a revelation. Buster discovered the joy of chasing strange six-legged insects and digging for roots that smelled interesting. Zilia discovered the sky. She would lie in the grass for hours next to her puppy, watching the unfamiliar clouds drift by her skin, shifting to a perfect azure blue. She waded in the cool, clear water of the river, her laughter mingling with Buster's happy splashes. The ghosts of Sanctuary Station and the fiery spectres of Catharia Prime grew more distant with every sunrise. One morning, Jake led her to a tilled plot of land beside their new home. The earth was dark and rich. In his hands, he held a small canvas bag. "I made you a promise," he said, opening the bag. Inside were seeds. Some were from earth corn beans and tomatoes. Others were cathar species he had painstakingly cultivated and saved from his arboretum, including the sweet bell-shaped laura fruit. "I promised we'd plant a garden." Zilia took a laura fruit seed, holding the tiny, precious object in her palm. It represented a link to a past that no longer hurt to remember. She closed her eyes, placing her other hand on the soil just as she had on their first day. She wasn't commanding the planet, but listening to it. "Here," she said, pointing to a patch of earth warmed by the morning sun. "The laura fruit wants to be here. The soil sings for it." And so they worked side by side. Jake dug the furrows his hands, rediscovering their old familiar purpose. Zilia followed, placing each seed with reverent care, humming a soft, tuneless melody, a cathar planting song she hadn't realized she remembered. Buster, their tireless supervisor, trotted between them, wagging his tail and occasionally trying to help by digging in all the wrong places. As the yellow sun of New Terra began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across their valley, they stood back to admire their work. It was just a small patch of turned earth, full of sleeping seeds. But it was also a statement of faith. It was the act of putting down roots of believing in tomorrow. Jake put his arm around Zilia's shoulders. She leaned against him, her head resting on his side. Buster came and sat on their feet, leaning his weight against them both. A man, a child, and a dog. A gardener, the last daughter of a lost world, and a heart friend. They were a pack. They were a family. And here in their garden at the edge of the galaxy, they were finally home. The story of Zilia, Jake, and Buster is a testament to the idea that sometimes the most profound healing comes not from advanced medicine or complex diplomacy, but from the simple, unconditional love of a trusting heart, whether it beats in the chest of a human, an alien child, or a furry, four-legged friend. It's a reminder that empathy is the truest universal language, and that courage isn't about being fearless, but about protecting those you love, no matter the odds. In the vast, cold emptiness of space, the warmth of a single connection can be enough to relight a universe. If this story touched your heart and sparked your imagination, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know we've connected with you. Share this journey with someone who needs a story of hope and healing. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from across the galaxy. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to life. Thank you for listening.